Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the English Talk community. I'm Julia, your host, and today we're diving into something I know you've been waiting for. How many of you have ever felt your heart racing before speaking English? You know exactly what I'm talking about. That moment when you have something to say, but the words just don't come out right. Well, today's episode will change that forever. I'm going to share the exact strategies that helped thousands of learners go from nervous and hesitant to confident and fluent. But first, if this sounds like something you need, hit that subscribe button right now because you don't want to miss what's coming next. You know what I love most about this community? It's that we're all in this together. Every single person listening right now has felt that frustrating moment when you know what you want to say in your mind, but somehow it gets lost between your thoughts and your mouth. I see it in your comments, I hear it in your messages, and honestly, I've been there too. Yes, even I had moments when English felt like this impossible mountain to climb. I remember when I first started helping English learners, I met this amazing woman named Catherine from Lyon. She had been studying English for 12 years. 12 years! She could read English novels, understand complex movies, even write beautiful emails. But when it came to speaking, she would freeze completely. Does this sound familiar? She told me that her biggest fear wasn't making mistakes. Her biggest fear was that people would think she was unintelligent, because she couldn't express her thoughts clearly in English. That conversation changed everything for me. I realized that fluency isn't really about knowing every word or having perfect pronunciation. It's about feeling comfortable enough to express yourself, even when you don't have all the perfect words. It's about building that inner confidence that says, I belong in this conversation and what I have to say matters. Today, I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine walking into any room, anywhere in the world, and feeling completely comfortable starting a conversation in English. Imagine expressing your ideas without that little voice in your head constantly judging every word you say. Imagine finally feeling like yourself when you speak English, not some nervous version of who you really are. This isn't just a dream. This is absolutely possible for you, and I'm going to show you exactly how to get there. But here's what I need you to understand first. The path to confident, fluent English isn't about memorizing more vocabulary words. It's not about studying complicated rules or trying to sound like someone you're not. It's about developing practical skills and the right mindset that will carry you through any English conversation. Let me tell you about Marcus from Vienna. When I first met him, he would prepare for English conversations like he was studying for an exam. He would write down possible questions, practice his answers, and still feel terrified when the actual conversation started. Why? Because real conversations don't follow scripts. Real conversations are messy, unpredictable, and beautiful in their own way. But here's what Marcus discovered, and what I want you to understand too. When you stop trying to control every word and start focusing on connecting with people, everything changes. When you realize that the person you're talking to wants to understand you, not judge you, the pressure disappears. When you accept that communication is about sharing ideas, not performing perfectly, you finally start to relax. I've worked with thousands of English learners from all over the world, and I can tell you this with complete confidence. Every single person who achieved fluency had one thing in common. They stopped waiting to be perfect and started practicing being brave. They stopped focusing on what they didn't know and started using what they did know. Right now, as you're listening to me, you're already practicing one of the most important skills for fluency. You're training your ear to understand natural English conversation. You're building familiarity with the rhythm, the flow, the way words connect together. This is huge, and I want you to recognize how valuable this practice time is. But listening is just the beginning. Real confidence comes when you start using your voice, when you start expressing your own thoughts and ideas. And that's exactly what we're going to work on together today. I'm going to give you specific, practical strategies that you can start using immediately. Not theoretical concepts, but real tools that work in real conversations. I want to share something personal with you. When I decided to create this podcast, people told me that there were already too many English learning resources out there. They said the market was crowded, that learners already had enough options. But you know what I realized? Most English learning focuses on rules and structures. Very few resources focus on the emotional side of language learning, on building real confidence, on helping you feel comfortable being yourself in English. That's what makes our community special. We understand that learning English isn't just about language skills. It's about personal growth, about expanding your world, about connecting with people you never could have reached before. It's about becoming the version of yourself who can share your ideas, your humor, your personality in a second language. Every person in this community brings something unique to the table. Maybe you're listening from Barcelona, working hard to improve your English for your career. Maybe you're in Berlin, dreaming of studying abroad. Maybe you're in Amsterdam, wanting to connect with international friends. Or perhaps you're in Rome, planning to travel the world and share your culture with others. Whatever brought you here, whatever your dreams are, I want you to know that they're possible. The English skills you need to achieve your goals aren't as far away as you think. In fact, you probably already have more ability than you give yourself credit for. The missing piece isn't usually knowledge. The missing piece is usually confidence and the right approach to practice. So here's what I want you to do right now. I want you to take a deep breath and make a commitment to yourself. Commit to being open to trying new approaches. Commit to being patient with yourself as you grow. Commit to celebrating small victories along the way. Most importantly, commit to believing that you can do this, because you absolutely can. Before we dive into these life-changing strategies, I need you to do something that will make a huge difference in your English journey. If you're serious about becoming fluent and confident, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. This simple action tells me you're committed to your growth, and it ensures you never miss the weekly tips and techniques that are transforming English learners around the world. Also, give this episode a thumbs up if you're ready to finally break through those speaking barriers that have been holding you back. I also want to hear your story because your experience matters to our community. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time when you felt nervous or confident speaking English. Maybe it was ordering food in a restaurant, giving a presentation at work, or having a conversation with a native speaker. What happened? How did you feel? What did you learn from that experience? Your story could inspire someone else who's facing the same challenges right now. Remember, we're all in this journey together, and every comment helps build our supportive English learning family. Let me tell you about Maria from Madrid. She studied English for 8 years, but couldn't order food at a restaurant without shaking. Sound familiar? Here's what she discovered that changed everything. Fluency isn't about perfect pronunciation or knowing every word in the dictionary. It's about feeling comfortable with what you know and using it without fear. You already know more English than you think. The problem isn't your knowledge, it's your confidence. When you shift your focus from being perfect to being understood, magic happens. Maria came to me after what she called her most embarrassing moment. She was in London for a business trip, staying at a beautiful hotel near the Thames. She had prepared for weeks, studying business English, practicing presentations, reviewing important vocabulary. But on her first evening, she went to a simple restaurant and completely froze when the waiter asked what she wanted to drink. She knew the words for water, juice, coffee, tea. She had practiced ordering food hundreds of times in her English classes. But in that moment, facing a real person who was waiting for her answer, her mind went completely blank. She told me she spent the entire meal pointing at items on the menu instead of speaking. The waiter was kind and patient, but Maria felt so frustrated with herself. Here she was, a successful marketing director who gave presentations to hundreds of people in Spanish, and she couldn't even order a simple meal in English. That night, she called me from her hotel room, almost crying, asking if she would ever be able to speak English naturally. What Maria didn't understand then, but what I want you to understand right now, is that her problem had nothing to do with her English skills. Her problem was that she had built up English conversations into these enormous, scary events in her mind. She had convinced herself that every English interaction was a test she might fail, instead of seeing them as simple human connections. I asked Maria to try something different. Instead of focusing on speaking perfectly, I wanted her to focus on being understood. Instead of worrying about making mistakes, I wanted her to concentrate on sharing her message. This might sound like a small change, but it completely transforms how you approach English conversations. Think about it this way. When you talk to a friend in your native language, are you thinking about every word choice? Are you worried about making small mistakes? Of course not. You're focused on sharing your thoughts, telling your story, connecting with that person. That's exactly the mindset you need to bring to English conversations. The next day, Maria tried a different approach. She went to a coffee shop near her hotel, and instead of preparing perfect sentences, she focused on one simple goal: getting coffee and maybe having a small, friendly interaction. She walked up to the counter and said, "Good morning, I want coffee, please." Simple, direct, clear. The barista smiled and asked what size. Maria said, "Medium, please." Then the barista asked if she wanted anything else. Maria smiled and said, "No, thank you, have a nice day." That was it. A simple, successful English conversation. No complex vocabulary, no perfect pronunciation, just clear communication between two people. But for Maria, it felt like winning the lottery. She realized that she had been making English conversations much more complicated than they needed to be. After that breakthrough, Maria started approaching English differently. Instead of trying to impress people with fancy words, she focused on expressing her ideas clearly. Instead of preparing long, complex sentences, she learned to break her thoughts into smaller, simpler pieces. Instead of worrying about her accent, she concentrated on speaking loudly and clearly enough to be understood. But here's the most important thing Maria discovered, and I want you to really hear this. The people she was talking to didn't care about her accent. They didn't notice her small mistakes. They weren't judging her English skills. They were just trying to understand what she wanted to communicate and respond appropriately. Once she realized this, her confidence began to grow naturally. You see, confidence isn't something you suddenly have one day. Confidence grows through positive experiences. Every time you successfully communicate something in English, even something small, you build a little more confidence. Every time you realize that people understand you despite your imperfections, you become a little braver for the next conversation. I remember another student, Jean-Pierre from Marseille, who had a similar experience. He was a chef who moved to Dublin to work in an international restaurant. His English was actually quite good on paper, but he was terrified of talking to customers. He was convinced that his French accent was too strong, that people wouldn't understand him, that he would embarrass himself and the restaurant. Jean-Pierre spent his first month barely speaking to anyone, except when absolutely necessary. He would communicate with his colleagues through gestures and very short phrases. He was miserable because cooking had always been about passion and connection for him, but he felt cut off from that joy because of his fear of speaking English. Then one evening, a customer asked him about a special dish he had created. Without thinking, Jean-Pierre started explaining his inspiration for the recipe, how he combined traditional French techniques with Irish ingredients, why he chose certain spices. He was so passionate about his cooking that he forgot to be nervous about his English. He talked for several minutes, using his hands to gesture, his eyes lighting up as he described his creative process. The customer was completely engaged, asking questions, complimenting the creativity. At the end of the conversation, she said, "Thank you so much for sharing that. Your passion for cooking really comes through, and your English is wonderful." Jean-Pierre was shocked. He had been speaking naturally, confidently, without worrying about perfection, and it had worked beautifully. That's when Jean-Pierre learned the same lesson Maria had discovered. When you focus on sharing something you care about, when you concentrate on connecting with another person, the language flows much more naturally. Your passion and authenticity matter more than perfect pronunciation or fancy vocabulary. This is what I call the confidence connection. Real confidence in English doesn't come from knowing every rule or having a perfect accent. It comes from successful communication experiences. It comes from realizing that people want to understand you, not judge you. It comes from focusing on your message instead of your mistakes. Right now, wherever you are, whatever your English level, you have the ability to communicate successfully. You might not be able to discuss complex philosophical topics yet, but you can certainly share basic information, express simple opinions, ask for what you need. The key is starting with what you can do well and building from there, rather than focusing on what you can't do yet. Remember Antonio from Rome? He used to create these incredibly complex sentences in his head before speaking. By the time he figured out the construction, the conversation had moved on. Then he learned this simple truth. Short sentences are your best friend. Instead of saying something complicated, say something simple. Instead of, "I was wondering if it would be possible for you to help me," just say, "Can you help me?" Your goal is communication, not impressing people with big words. When I first met Antonio, he was working as a tour guide in Rome, taking international visitors around the city he loved so much. He knew everything about Roman history, architecture, art, and culture. In Italian, he could tell fascinating stories that kept tourists captivated for hours. But when he tried to share the same stories in English, something strange happened. He would start a sentence, get halfway through, realize he was making it too complicated, stop himself, start over, and eventually just give up and point to things instead of explaining them. Antonio told me that he felt like two different people. In Italian, he was confident, articulate, passionate, and engaging. In English, he felt clumsy, confused, and frustrated. He said it was like trying to paint a beautiful picture with his hands tied behind his back. He had all these amazing thoughts and stories in his mind, but he couldn't get them out in a way that felt natural or satisfying. The problem was that Antonio was trying to translate his complex Italian thoughts directly into English. In Italian, he might say something like, "What I would really like you to understand about this particular fountain is that it represents not just artistic achievement, but also the political power struggles of the 17th century." When he tried to say the same thing in English, he would get lost in the middle, forget parts of the sentence, and end up frustrated. I taught Antonio something that completely changed his approach. I told him to think like a child learning to speak. Children don't use complex sentences when they're starting out. They say simple, clear things like, "This is big, I like this, look at that." And you know what? Everyone understands them perfectly. They communicate effectively without any complexity at all. So we practiced breaking down Antonio's complex thoughts into simple, clear sentences. Instead of that long explanation about the fountain, he learned to say, "This fountain is very old. It was built in the 1600s. The design shows political power. Artists wanted to impress important people." 4 simple sentences that communicated the same information much more effectively than one complicated sentence he might never finish. At first, Antonio felt like he was being too simple, like he wasn't showing his intelligence or knowledge. But something amazing happened when he started using this approach with tourists. People began engaging with him more. They asked questions. They looked more interested. They seemed to understand and remember more of what he was telling them. One day, he was guiding a family from Manchester through the Colosseum. Using his new simple sentence approach, he said, "The Colosseum held 50,000 people. The fights happened in the center. Wild animals came from Africa. The crowd decided who lived or died. The family was completely fascinated. The children asked dozens of questions. The parents took photos and said it was the best tour they had ever experienced." That's when Antonio realized something important. Simple doesn't mean stupid. Clear doesn't mean boring. When you communicate simply and clearly, people can actually focus on your ideas instead of trying to figure out what you're trying to say. Your message becomes more powerful, not less powerful. I see this mistake constantly with English learners. You think that using complex sentences makes you sound more intelligent or more fluent, but the opposite is usually true. When you use sentences that are too complex for your current level, you often make mistakes, lose your train of thought, or confuse your listener. Simple, clear sentences delivered confidently always sound better than complex sentences delivered with hesitation and errors. Let me give you some examples of how you can transform complex thoughts into simple, powerful sentences. Instead of saying, "I was wondering if you might have the time to possibly explain to me how this system works," you can say, "Can you explain this system?" Instead of, "I would be very grateful if you could perhaps consider helping me with this problem," you can say, "Please help me with this problem." The simple versions are not only easier for you to say, but they're also easier for the other person to understand and respond to. They create clearer communication and more natural conversation flow. Another student of mine, Isabella from Barcelona, discovered this same principle in her workplace. She was working for an international company and had to participate in English conference calls every week. She would spend hours preparing elaborate responses to potential questions, writing out long, complex sentences to make sure she sounded professional and intelligent. But during the actual calls, she would get nervous and stumble over her prepared sentences. Her colleagues would ask her to repeat herself, or worse, they would just move on without fully understanding her input. She felt invisible and frustrated in these important meetings. I worked with Isabella on breaking down her ideas into simple, direct statements. Instead of preparing one long response, she learned to prepare 3 or 4 short sentences. Instead of trying to say everything at once, she learned to make one clear point and then wait for a response before adding more information. The change was remarkable. In her next meeting, when someone asked about budget concerns, instead of delivering a prepared paragraph, Isabella simply said, "The budget is too small. We need more money for marketing. I can send you the exact numbers after this call." Her colleagues immediately understood. They asked follow-up questions. She felt heard and included in the conversation for the first time. This approach works because it matches how native speakers actually communicate in real conversations. We don't usually speak in long, complex paragraphs. We share ideas in pieces. We build understanding gradually. We check that the other person is following before we add more detail. Think about conversations in your native language. When you're explaining something to a friend, do you give one long, complicated explanation, or do you share information bit by bit, watching their reaction, answering their questions as they come up? You naturally break information into digestible pieces because that's how effective communication works. The beauty of simple sentences is that they give you confidence. When you know you can clearly express one idea at a time, you feel more in control of the conversation. You're not worried about getting lost in the middle of a complex sentence. You're not afraid of making mistakes that will confuse your message. You can focus on connecting with the other person rather than managing complicated language structures. Simple sentences also make it easier for people to respond to you. When you say something clear and direct, the other person knows exactly how to reply. This creates natural back-and-forth conversation flow, which makes everything feel more comfortable and engaging for everyone involved. Here's something that might sound strange but works incredibly well. Start talking to yourself in English every day. I know Sarah from Berlin who transformed her speaking skills by narrating her daily activities. When she brushed her teeth, she'd say, "I'm brushing my teeth now." When she cooked dinner, she'd describe what she was doing. This builds your speaking muscles without the pressure of a real conversation. You can make mistakes, laugh at yourself, and try again. It's like having a private English gym. When I first suggested this to Sarah, she looked at me like I was completely crazy. She said, "Julia, you want me to talk to myself? People will think I'm losing my mind." But Sarah was desperate. She had been taking English classes for 3 years. She could understand movies and read books. But when it came to actually speaking, the words just wouldn't come out smoothly. She would think in German, translate to English in her head, then try to speak, and by that time, she had lost her confidence and her train of thought. I explained to Sarah that talking to yourself is actually one of the most natural ways to practice speaking any language. Think about it. When you were a child learning your first language, you probably talked to yourself all the time. You narrated your play, you had conversations with your toys, you described what you were doing. This wasn't strange or unusual. It was your brain's natural way of practicing language skills in a safe, pressure-free environment. The beautiful thing about talking to yourself in English is that there's no judgment, no time pressure, no fear of embarrassing yourself in front of others. You can stop and start whenever you want. You can repeat the same sentence 10 times until it feels natural. You can experiment with different ways of saying the same thing. You can even have entire conversations with imaginary people about topics you care about. Sarah was skeptical, but she agreed to try it for 1 week. I told her to start simple. Just describe what she was doing as she did it. When she woke up in the morning, say, "I'm waking up now, I'm stretching, I'm getting out of bed." And when she made coffee, say, "I'm putting water in the machine, I'm adding coffee, I'm waiting for it to brew." The first day felt awkward for Sarah. She kept forgetting to do it, and when she remembered, she felt self-conscious, even though she was alone in her apartment. But I had warned her about this. I told her that any new habit feels strange at first, but if she stuck with it, it would start feeling natural very quickly. By the 3rd day, something interesting happened. Sarah started enjoying these little conversations with herself. She began adding more details, more opinions, more personality to her narration. Instead of just saying, "I'm making coffee," she would say, "I'm making coffee now. I love the smell of fresh coffee in the morning. This is my favorite part of the day." After a week, Sarah called me with excitement in her voice. She said that her English speaking had already improved noticeably, not just the fluency, but also her confidence. She realized that she actually knew more English words than she thought she did. When there was no pressure to perform or impress anyone, the words came much more naturally. But here's what really convinced Sarah that this technique was powerful. She was at work and needed to explain a project to an international colleague. Usually, she would spend several minutes preparing what she wanted to say, writing down key points, practicing in her head. But this time, she found herself speaking much more naturally and spontaneously. The words flowed more easily because she had been practicing the physical act of speaking English every day at home. Sarah realized that speaking is like any other physical skill. If you want to get better at playing piano, you need to practice moving your fingers on the keys. If you want to get better at dancing, you need to practice moving your body to music. If you want to get better at speaking English, you need to practice moving your mouth, your tongue, your breath to create English sounds and rhythms. I had another student, Miguel from Valencia, who took this concept even further. Miguel was preparing for a job interview in English, and he was extremely nervous about it. I suggested that he practice not just describing his daily activities, but also having mock conversations about topics that might come up in the interview. Miguel would stand in his kitchen while cooking dinner and pretend he was answering interview questions. He would say things like, "Tell me about yourself." "Well, I'm Miguel, and I work in marketing. I have 5 years of experience. I love solving problems for customers." Then he would pause, imagine the interviewer asking a follow-up question, and continue the conversation. This practice was incredibly valuable because Miguel could experiment with different ways of expressing the same ideas. He could practice handling difficult questions without the stress of a real interview situation. He could work on his timing, his tone, his confidence. By the time the real interview came, he felt prepared and natural because he had essentially had dozens of practice interviews in his own kitchen. The key to making this technique work is consistency and gradual expansion. Start with simple narration of your daily activities. "I'm opening the door, I'm walking outside. The weather is nice today. I'm going to the store." As this becomes comfortable, start adding more complex thoughts and opinions. "I'm walking to the store and thinking about what to buy for dinner. I want to cook something healthy but also delicious. Maybe I'll try that new recipe I saw online." Eventually, you can have full conversations with yourself about topics you're interested in. You can practice explaining your job, describing your hobbies, sharing your opinions about current events, telling stories about your experiences. The more you practice expressing your own thoughts and ideas in English, the more natural it becomes when you need to do it in real conversations. One of the biggest advantages of this technique is that you can practice anywhere and anytime. You don't need special materials, you don't need to schedule time with other people, you don't need to be in a classroom. You can practice while you're getting dressed, while you're cooking, while you're cleaning, while you're walking somewhere. This makes it incredibly easy to get lots of practice time without disrupting your normal routine. Another benefit is that you're practicing with content that's personally relevant to you. You're not repeating generic textbook phrases about topics you don't care about. You're expressing your own thoughts, describing your own life, talking about things that matter to you. This makes the practice more engaging and more memorable. The English you practice is the English you actually need to use in your real life. Stand in front of a mirror and have conversations with yourself. I learned this from Thomas in Paris, who went from barely speaking to giving presentations in English. Look yourself in the eye and practice introducing yourself, talking about your day, or explaining your favorite hobby. The mirror forces you to maintain eye contact and builds the same confidence you need in real conversations. Start with just 2 minutes a day and watch how your comfort level grows. Thomas was a software engineer working for a tech startup in Paris. His company was expanding internationally, and suddenly he found himself needing to give presentations to English-speaking clients and investors. The problem was that Thomas had what I call invisible English syndrome. He could write perfect emails, he understood everything in meetings, he could even participate in small group discussions, but put him in front of a room full of people expecting him to present in English, and he would panic completely. When Thomas first contacted me, he told me about his most embarrassing professional moment. He had spent weeks preparing a presentation about a new software feature his team had developed. He knew the material inside and out, he was proud of the work, and he was excited to share it. But when he stood up in front of 12 potential investors, his mind went blank. He started sweating, his voice became shaky, and he could barely get through the first slide before asking his English-speaking colleague to take over. That night, Thomas felt like his career was stuck. He was brilliant at his job, but if he couldn't communicate his ideas confidently in English, he would never be able to advance in an international company. He felt frustrated because he knew his English was good enough. The problem wasn't his vocabulary or his understanding. The problem was his confidence when all eyes were on him. I introduced Thomas to the mirror technique, and like most people, his first reaction was skepticism mixed with embarrassment. He said, "Julia, I feel ridiculous talking to myself in a mirror. This seems like something actors do, not software engineers." But I explained to him that this technique addresses something crucial that most English learners completely ignore: the psychological and physical aspects of confident communication. When you speak English in real situations, you're not just using language skills. You're also managing eye contact, body language, voice projection, and the emotional pressure of being watched and evaluated by others. Most English practice focuses only on the language part, but completely ignores these other crucial elements. The mirror technique helps you practice all of these skills together in a safe environment. I told Thomas to start with just 2 minutes every morning. Stand in front of his bathroom mirror and practice introducing himself as if he were meeting someone new. Hello, my name is Thomas. I'm a software engineer from Paris. I work on mobile applications for healthcare companies. Simple, basic, but looking himself in the eye while saying it. The first few days were uncomfortable for Thomas. He kept looking away from his own eyes. He felt silly, and he wanted to stop after 30 seconds. But I had warned him that this was normal. I told him that the awkwardness he felt looking at himself in the mirror was exactly the same awkwardness he felt when people were looking at him during presentations. By practicing with his own reflection, he was gradually building tolerance for being watched while speaking. After a week of this daily practice, Thomas started to notice something interesting. Making eye contact with himself became easier. His voice sounded stronger and clearer. He began adding more details to his self-introduction, talking about projects he was working on, sharing his opinions about technology trends. The mirror stopped feeling like a judgment and started feeling like a supportive audience. Then Thomas decided to expand the technique. Instead of just introducing himself, he began practicing explaining his work. He would stand in front of the mirror and pretend he was giving a presentation to potential clients. Our new app helps doctors track patient medications more efficiently. The interface is simple and intuitive. Doctors can update information quickly between appointments. He practiced gesturing naturally, maintaining eye contact, speaking at an appropriate pace. The breakthrough came about 3 weeks later. Thomas had another presentation to give, this time to a group of doctors who were considering using his company's software. Instead of feeling the usual panic, Thomas felt prepared. He had essentially given this presentation dozens of times to his mirror. He knew exactly how to explain each feature. He had practiced handling potential questions, and most importantly, he had built confidence in his ability to maintain eye contact and speak clearly while being watched. The presentation went beautifully. Thomas spoke for 20 minutes without notes, answered questions confidently, and even added some humor that made the audience laugh. Afterwards, his boss asked him what had changed, how he had become such a confident presenter so quickly. Thomas almost didn't want to admit that his secret weapon was talking to himself in his bathroom mirror every morning. But that's exactly what had made the difference. The mirror technique had helped Thomas practice not just the language, but the entire experience of confident communication. He had trained himself to be comfortable being watched, to maintain eye contact without feeling nervous, to project his voice clearly, and to trust that his English was good enough to communicate his ideas effectively. I've seen this technique work for so many different people in so many different situations. Elena from Stockholm used it to prepare for job interviews. She would practice answering common interview questions while looking herself in the eye, building the confidence she needed to present herself professionally. After 2 months of daily mirror practice, she landed her dream job at an international marketing agency. Roberto from Milan used the mirror technique to overcome his fear of small talk. He was great at discussing work topics in English, but he froze up completely when colleagues wanted to chat about weekend plans or current events. Roberto started practicing casual conversations with his mirror. "How was your weekend?" "Oh, it was great. I went hiking with some friends. The weather was perfect." "What about you?" These simple exchanges helped him feel prepared for spontaneous social interactions. The mirror technique works because it combines several important elements that regular English practice often misses. First, it forces you to maintain eye contact, which is crucial for confident communication, but often overlooked in language learning. Second, it helps you practice body language and gestures that support your words. Third, it allows you to hear your own voice and adjust your volume, pace, and tone. Most importantly, the mirror technique helps you become comfortable being the center of attention while speaking English. When you can look yourself in the eye and speak confidently, it becomes much easier to look other people in the eye and speak confidently. You build familiarity with the physical sensations of confident speaking, standing tall, breathing deeply, making steady eye contact, projecting your voice clearly. The key to success with this technique is consistency and gradual progression. Start with just 2 minutes a day, and simple topics like introducing yourself, or describing your day. As you become more comfortable, expand to longer conversations and more complex topics. Practice explaining things you care about, sharing your opinions, telling stories from your life. This is huge, and I want you to really listen. When you translate from your native language to English in your head, you create a delay that kills natural conversation flow. Instead, think directly in English about simple things. Start small. When you see a red car, think red car in English, not in your language first. Lisa from Amsterdam practiced this for just 2 weeks and noticed her response time improved dramatically. Your brain can learn to think in English, but you have to train it. Lisa came to me with a problem that affects almost every English learner I've ever worked with. She would be in conversations where she understood everything perfectly. She knew exactly what she wanted to say, but there would be these long, awkward pauses while her brain worked behind the scenes. She described it like having a very slow computer that needed to run a translation program every time she wanted to speak. Lisa told me about a particularly frustrating experience at her job in Amsterdam. She worked for an international consulting firm, and during team meetings, her English-speaking colleagues would have these rapid, dynamic discussions about projects. Lisa could follow every word they said. She had valuable insights to contribute. But by the time she had mentally translated her thoughts from Dutch to English, the conversation had moved on to a completely different topic. She felt like she was always one step behind, like she was watching a movie instead of participating in real life. Her colleagues were patient and kind, but Lisa could see them sometimes forget to include her in discussions because her responses took so long. She was worried that her career would be limited not by her skills or intelligence, but by this translation delay that made her seem slow or disengaged. The problem Lisa was experiencing is incredibly common, and it happens because most of us learn English by building it on top of our native language. We learn that dog means the same as our word for dog, that happy means the same as our word for happy. This creates a mental system where English words are connected to our native language words, rather than being connected directly to meanings and concepts. When you think in your native language and then translate to English, your brain has to do extra work. It has to access the concept, find the word in your native language, then find the English equivalent, then check if that's the right word to use, then figure out how to put it together with other words. This process might only take a few seconds, but in a natural conversation, a few seconds feels like forever. I explained to Lisa that she needed to start training her brain to think directly in English, bypassing the translation step completely. This might sound impossible, but it's actually how young children learn their first language. They don't translate dog from some other language. They see a furry animal, hear the sound dog, and their brain creates a direct connection between the concept and the English word. The key is to start incredibly small and build up gradually. I told Lisa to begin with objects she could see around her. When she saw a blue pen on her desk, instead of thinking the Dutch word first and then translating to blue pen, she should train herself to think blue pen directly. When she saw her coffee cup, think coffee cup. When she looked out the window and saw clouds, think clouds. At first, this felt strange and forced for Lisa. Her natural instinct was to think in Dutch because that was her brain's default language for internal thoughts. But I encouraged her to be patient with the process. I told her that she was essentially creating new neural pathways, and like any new habit, it would feel awkward at the beginning but become automatic with practice. Lisa started carrying this practice into simple daily activities. When she brushed her teeth in the morning, instead of thinking about it in Dutch, she would consciously think, "I'm brushing my teeth" in English. When she felt hungry instead of the Dutch thought process, she would think, "I'm hungry," directly in English. When she looked at the clock, she would think, "It's 9:30, rather than translating from Dutch time expressions. After about a week of this conscious practice, something interesting started happening. Lisa noticed that some simple English thoughts were beginning to occur automatically, without her forcing them. She would see rain outside and immediately think, "It's raining," in English, without any conscious effort or translation process. But the real breakthrough came when Lisa started applying this technique to emotions and reactions. When someone told a funny joke at work, instead of thinking her amusement in Dutch and then translating it, she trained herself to think, "That's funny," or "That's hilarious," directly in English. When she felt frustrated with a difficult task, she practiced thinking, "This is frustrating" in English rather than her natural Dutch response. The change in Lisa's conversation skills was remarkable. Her response time improved dramatically because she was no longer running everything through a mental translation program. When colleagues asked her opinion about something, she could respond much more quickly because her thoughts were already partially formed in English. But even more important than speed was the naturalness of her responses. When you think directly in English, you naturally use English expressions, English ways of organizing ideas, English rhythm and flow. When you translate from your native language, you often end up with responses that are technically correct but don't sound quite natural because they follow the patterns of your first language. I had another student, Carlos from Seville, who experienced this same transformation. Carlos was a doctor who needed to use English with international patients and colleagues. His medical knowledge was excellent, and his English vocabulary was quite good, but his consultation style felt stilted and formal because he was translating everything from Spanish thought patterns. When Carlos started thinking directly in English during medical consultations, his bedside manner improved significantly. Instead of translating formal Spanish medical expressions, he began using more natural English ways of explaining things to patients. Instead of, "You are experiencing inflammation in your respiratory system," he would naturally think and say, "Your lungs are a bit inflamed." The direct English thinking led to more natural, patient-friendly communication. The key to making this work is consistency and patience. You're not trying to think everything in English immediately. You're gradually expanding the areas of your life where English thinking feels natural. Start with concrete objects and simple actions. Then move to basic emotions and reactions. Eventually, you can work toward thinking through more complex ideas and opinions directly in English. One technique that really helped Lisa was what I call English commentary. Throughout her day, she would provide a running commentary of her activities in English, thinking the thoughts rather than speaking them out loud. Now I'm opening my email. I have 5 new messages. The first one is from my boss. He wants to schedule a meeting. I should reply quickly. This internal English commentary served 2 purposes. First, it gave Lisa lots of practice thinking directly in English about everyday situations. Second, it helped her brain get used to processing her immediate reality through English words and concepts rather than Dutch ones. Another helpful approach is to designate certain activities or times of day as English thinking zones. Lisa decided that her morning coffee time would always be in English. During those 15 minutes, she would consciously think about her day ahead, her plans, her feelings, all in English. This created a regular practice time while also making the habit feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Here's a practical technique that works wonders. Before any English conversation, take 3 deep breaths, count to 2, then speak for 1 minute about anything. This calms your nerves and gets your English brain activated. Roberto from Milan uses this before every work meeting and says it completely changed his confidence level. The counting gives your brain time to switch to English mode while the deep breathing relaxes your body. When Roberto first told me about his problem, I could hear the frustration in his voice. He was a marketing manager at a fashion company in Milan, and his job required him to participate in weekly video calls with international clients and partners. Roberto's English was actually quite good. He could write professional emails, understand complex presentations, and follow detailed discussions about marketing strategies and sales figures. But there was something that happened to Roberto at the beginning of every English meeting that made him feel completely unprepared and anxious. The first 5 or 10 minutes were always terrible for him. His colleagues would be chatting naturally, discussing weekend plans or current projects, and Roberto would sit there feeling like his English had completely disappeared. His mind would be blank, his heart would be racing, and he would struggle to contribute even simple comments or questions. Roberto described it as feeling like his brain needed time to warm up for English, like an old car that won't start on the first try in winter. By the middle of the meeting, he would feel much more comfortable and confident, but those first crucial minutes made him seem disengaged or unprepared to his international colleagues. I recognized this problem immediately because it's incredibly common among English learners who use the language professionally. Your brain gets comfortable operating in your native language throughout the day, and then suddenly you need to switch to English for important conversations. Without any transition time, your English feels rusty and unreliable, even though you know it's actually quite good. That's when I introduced Roberto to what I call the 3-2-1 speaking method. The concept is simple but incredibly effective. Before any important English conversation or meeting, you take 3 deep breaths, count to 2 in your head, then speak in English for 1 full minute about anything at all. This process serves multiple purposes that address both the psychological and practical challenges of switching to English mode. The 3 deep breaths are crucial for managing the physical symptoms of language anxiety. When you're nervous about speaking English, your body reacts as if you're facing a threat. Your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes shallow, your muscles tense up. These physical reactions make it much harder to think clearly and speak smoothly. The deep breathing activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which helps your body relax and your mind focus. The counting to 2 might seem like a small detail, but it serves an important psychological function. It gives your brain a moment to consciously shift from your native language mode to English mode. Think of it as a mental gear change. You're telling your brain, okay, now we're going to think and communicate in English, and giving it a brief moment to make that transition. The 1 minute of speaking about anything is where the real magic happens. This isn't about practicing specific vocabulary or rehearsing what you want to say in the actual conversation. This is about getting your mouth, your brain, and your confidence working together in English. You're activating all the systems you need for fluent English communication before you need to use them for something important. Roberto started using this technique 15 minutes before every international meeting. He would go to a quiet conference room or even the bathroom, and he would do his 3-2-1 routine. He would take 3 slow, deep breaths, count to 2, then spend 1 minute talking about whatever came to mind. Sometimes he would describe what he had for breakfast. Sometimes he would talk about his plans for the weekend. Sometimes he would give his opinion about the weather or a movie he had seen. The topic didn't matter at all. What mattered was that he was getting his English flowing naturally before he needed to use it professionally. After just 1 week of using this technique, Roberto noticed a dramatic difference in how he felt during the first few minutes of meetings. Instead of sitting silently while his brain slowly warmed up to English, he was ready to participate actively from the very beginning. But the 3-2-1 method isn't just useful for professional situations. I've taught it to students who use it before job interviews, before social gatherings with international friends, before phone calls with English-speaking family members, before any situation where they want to feel confident and prepared in English. The beauty of this technique is that it's completely flexible and private. You can do it anywhere, anytime, without any special materials or preparation. If you're about to go into a restaurant where you'll need to order in English, you can do a quick 3-2-1 in the car before you go inside. If you're about to call customer service for an English-speaking company, you can do it while the phone is ringing. Maria from Barcelona used this method before dates with English-speaking men she met through international dating apps. She was fluent in English, but first dates made her nervous in any language, and the combination of romantic anxiety plus language switching made her feel tongue-tied and awkward. The 3-2-1 method helped her feel more like herself from the very beginning of these dates. One of my favorite success stories comes from Andrea in Rome, who used this technique before giving a presentation at an international conference. She had spent weeks preparing her presentation. She knew her material perfectly, and her English was excellent. But she was terrified that she would freeze up in front of hundreds of people from around the world. The morning of her presentation, Andrea found a quiet corner backstage and did an extended version of the 3-2-1 method. She took 3 deep breaths, counted to 2, then spent 3 full minutes talking about her research, her excitement about presenting, and her hopes for the audience's response. By the time she walked onto the stage, she felt calm, confident, and ready. Her presentation was a huge success, and she later told me that those 3 minutes of private English speaking had made all the difference. The 3-2-1 method works because it addresses the complete experience of English communication, not just the language skills. It helps you manage anxiety, transition your brain to English mode, warm up your speaking muscles, and build confidence all at the same time. It's like doing a complete warm-up routine before athletic performance, except it only takes a few minutes and you can do it anywhere. The key to success with this technique is making it a consistent habit rather than something you only remember to do when you're feeling particularly nervous. Roberto now does his 3-2-1 routine before every English conversation, whether it's a high-stakes business meeting or a casual chat with a tourist asking for directions. This consistency means his English is always warmed up and ready, and he never has to worry about those awkward first few minutes when his brain is still switching languages. Let me share something important. Your accent is not a problem. It's part of who you are. Hans from Vienna spent years trying to sound like a native speaker and felt frustrated every day. Then he realized that clear communication matters more than perfect pronunciation. People want to understand you, not judge your accent. When you accept your accent and focus on being clear rather than perfect, you'll speak with much more confidence. Hans contacted me after what he called his breaking point with English pronunciation. He had been living in London for 4 years, working as an architect for an international firm. His English was excellent in every way except one thing that consumed his thoughts constantly. Hans was obsessed with his Austrian accent and convinced that it made him sound unprofessional and unintelligent to his British colleagues. Hans told me that he spent hours every week listening to BBC News and trying to copy the exact pronunciation of the presenters. He practiced British vowel sounds in front of mirrors. He recorded himself speaking and compared it to native speakers, always finding his pronunciation lacking. He even considered hiring a speech coach to help him eliminate what he saw as the embarrassing traces of his Austrian background in his English. The irony was that Hans was actually a brilliant communicator. His ideas about sustainable architecture were innovative and inspiring. His presentations were well organized and thoughtful. His colleagues respected his expertise and enjoyed working with him. But Hans couldn't see any of these strengths because he was so focused on the way his voice sounded when he spoke English. Everything changed for Hans during a project meeting, where he was presenting a new building design to potential clients. He had prepared extensively, as always, and he was passionate about the environmental benefits of his design. But 5 minutes into his presentation, he mispronounced a technical term in a way that sounded distinctly Austrian. Instead of continuing with confidence, Hans stopped, apologized for his pronunciation, corrected himself, and then seemed to lose his momentum entirely. After the meeting, one of the clients approached Hans privately. The client said, "Your presentation was fascinating, and your passion for sustainable design really came through. But I noticed you seemed to get distracted by your pronunciation. I want you to know that your accent doesn't interfere with your message at all. In fact, it makes you memorable and authentic. I've heard dozens of presentations from British architects, but yours stood out because of your unique perspective and the genuine enthusiasm in your voice." That conversation was a revelation for Hans. He realized that he had been solving the wrong problem. He thought his accent was preventing people from taking him seriously, but actually his obsession with his accent was what was undermining his confidence and effectiveness as a communicator. I explained to Hans something that I wish every English learner understood from the beginning. Accents are not mistakes to be corrected. They are the natural result of your mouth and brain applying the pronunciation patterns of your first language to your second language. Every single person who speaks more than one language has an accent when speaking their non-native languages. Even native English speakers have accents that vary dramatically depending on where they grew up. The goal should never be to eliminate your accent completely. The goal should be to communicate clearly and confidently. There's a huge difference between having an accent and being difficult to understand. Hans spoke extremely clearly. His vowel sounds might have been influenced by German, but every word was distinct and comprehensible. His rhythm and intonation were natural and pleasant to listen to. I worked with Hans on shifting his focus from perfect pronunciation to clear communication. Instead of trying to sound British, he learned to concentrate on speaking at an appropriate pace, enunciating clearly, and using good volume and intonation. These elements have much more impact on successful communication than matching native speaker pronunciation exactly. We practiced what I call confident imperfection. Hans learned to continue speaking smoothly, even when he knew his pronunciation wasn't perfect. Instead of stopping to correct himself every time he noticed his accent, he trained himself to keep his focus on his message and his connection with his listeners. This change alone made his presentations much more engaging and professional. One of the most liberating exercises I gave Hans was to listen to successful non-native English speakers in his field. We found interviews with famous architects from Italy, Spain, Japan, and India who spoke English fluently and confidently while maintaining their distinctive accents. Hans realized that these respected professionals weren't trying to hide their backgrounds. Their accents were part of their professional identity, and nobody questioned their expertise because of how they sounded. This opened Hans's eyes to something crucial about international communication. In most professional and social contexts, people are interacting with speakers from many different countries and backgrounds. British, American, Australian, and Canadian accents are just 4 variations among dozens of ways that fluent English speakers sound around the world. There's no single correct way for English to sound. I had a similar experience with Carmen from Madrid, who worked as a tour guide for international visitors to Spain. Carmen spoke beautiful English, but she was convinced that her Spanish accent made her sound unprofessional compared to native English-speaking guides. She spent months trying to neutralize her pronunciation, focusing so much on how she sounded that she lost the warmth and enthusiasm that made her such an effective guide. When Carmen finally embraced her natural speaking style, including her Spanish accent, something wonderful happened. Tourists began commenting specifically on how much they enjoyed her tours. They said she sounded authentic and passionate, that her slight accent made her more relatable and interesting to listen to. One American visitor told Carmen that her accent actually helped him feel more immersed in the Spanish cultural experience. The truth is that many people find non-native accents charming, interesting, and even easier to understand than some regional native accents. Your accent tells a story about who you are and where you come from. It connects you to your heritage and your journey as a language learner. When you try to hide or eliminate your accent, you're essentially trying to hide part of your identity. But accepting your accent doesn't mean giving up on clear communication. There are specific things you can do to ensure that your accent enhances rather than interferes with your message. Focus on speaking slowly enough that each word is distinct. Pay attention to word stress and sentence rhythm, which are more important for comprehension than individual sound accuracy. Practice good breathing and volume control so that people can hear you easily. Most importantly, work on your confidence and fluency. When you speak hesitantly or apologetically, people notice your uncertainty much more than your accent. When you speak with confidence and enthusiasm, your accent becomes part of your charm rather than something that distracts from your message. I remember Alessandro from Florence, who had a breakthrough moment during a business presentation. He had always been self-conscious about his Italian accent when speaking English with international clients. But during one particularly important presentation, he became so engaged with explaining a new product innovation that he completely forgot to monitor his pronunciation. He spoke passionately and naturally for 20 minutes, using gestures and vocal variety to emphasize his points. After the presentation, the client said it was the most compelling product demonstration they had heard in years. They didn't mention Alessandro's accent at all. They talked about his expertise, his passion, and the clarity of his explanations. Alessandro realized that when he focused on connecting with his audience rather than perfecting his sounds, he became a much more effective communicator. Native speakers use filler words all the time. Words like, well, you know, actually, and I mean, give you time to think while keeping the conversation flowing. Carmen from Barcelona learned to use phrases like, that's a good question, or let me think about that, when she needed extra seconds to organize her thoughts. These phrases are perfectly normal and help you sound more natural while giving your brain time to process. Carmen came to me with a problem that was affecting her confidence in every English conversation she had. She worked as a customer service manager for a hotel chain in Barcelona, and her job required her to handle complaints and questions from international guests. Carmen's English vocabulary was excellent, and she understood everything guests said to her, but she struggled with what she called thinking time during conversations. When guests asked her complex questions or presented her with unusual problems, Carmen knew she had the knowledge to help them, but she needed a few seconds to organize her thoughts and figure out the best solution. In Spanish, this was never a problem. She would naturally use small phrases and sounds that kept the conversation flowing while she thought. But in English, she felt like she had to either respond immediately or create awkward silences while her brain worked. Carmen told me about a particularly embarrassing incident with an American family who had a complicated issue with their reservation. The father asked her a detailed question about changing their room type while keeping the same dates and modifying their meal plan. Carmen understood the question perfectly and knew exactly how to solve the problem, but she needed a moment to check their booking details and calculate the price difference. Instead of saying anything, Carmen just stood there silently for what felt like forever while she worked through the solution in her head. The American father started looking uncomfortable and eventually said, "Hello? Are you still there?" Carmen felt mortified. She quickly explained the solution, but the whole interaction felt awkward and unprofessional, even though she had ultimately provided excellent service. That's when I introduced Carmen to what I call buying time phrases and natural filler words. These are the small words and expressions that native speakers use constantly to keep conversations flowing smoothly while they organize their thoughts. The amazing thing is that most English learners don't realize how normal and useful these phrases are, because they're rarely taught in textbooks or formal classes. I explained to Carmen that when native English speakers need time to think, they don't just stay silent. They use phrases like, let me see. That's a good question. Well, let me think about that. Or, okay, so you're asking about. These phrases serve several important functions. They acknowledge that you've heard the other person, they indicate that you're actively working on an answer, and they keep the conversation feeling natural and connected. We practiced with realistic scenarios from Carmen's work. When someone asked about room availability instead of silent thinking time, Carmen learned to say, "Let me check that for you," while she looked at the computer. When guests had complex requests, she could say, "Okay, so you want to modify your booking. Let me see what I can do," while she figured out the details. The transformation in Carmen's confidence was immediate. She realized that these phrases didn't make her sound uncertain or unprofessional. Instead, they made her sound thoughtful and engaged. Guests appreciated knowing that she was actively working on their problems rather than wondering if she had understood their questions. But filler words and buying time phrases aren't just useful in customer service situations. I've taught these techniques to English learners in every profession and social situation you can imagine. David from Lisbon used them during job interviews when he needed time to think about complex questions. Instead of uncomfortable pauses, he learned to say, "That's a really interesting question, let me think about my experience with that," before giving his detailed answer. Nina from Stockholm used these phrases during social conversations with international friends. When someone asked her opinion about a movie or current event, instead of feeling pressured to respond immediately, she could say, "Well, I have mixed feelings about that," while she organized her thoughts. This made her sound more natural and gave her confidence to participate more actively in group discussions. The key insight that changed everything for these students was realizing that native speakers are constantly using these little phrases and sounds. If you pay attention to natural English conversations, you'll hear, well, actually, so, anyway, and dozens of other small words that serve no other purpose than keeping conversations flowing smoothly while people think. Some English learners worry that using filler words makes them sound less fluent or less intelligent. This is completely backwards. Strategic use of natural filler words actually makes you sound more fluent because it mimics how native speakers naturally handle thinking time in conversations. The key word here is strategic. You want to use these phrases when you genuinely need time to think, not as a crutch for every sentence. I taught Carmen to build a toolkit of different phrases for different situations. For acknowledging questions, she could use, "That's a good question. Let me see," or, "Okay, so you're asking about." For buying thinking time, she could use, "Well, let me think. That's interesting." Or, "You know what? Let me check on that." For transitioning to her answer, she could use, "So here's what I can do. Actually, we have a few options." Or, "Let me explain how this works." The beauty of these phrases is that they're completely natural and authentic. You're not using complicated vocabulary or trying to impress anyone. You're simply using the same small words and expressions that keep all English conversations flowing naturally. Once Carmen became comfortable with these phrases, she started noticing them everywhere in English movies, podcasts, and real conversations. One of Carmen's breakthrough moments came during a busy weekend at the hotel, when she had to handle multiple guest requests simultaneously. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the need to respond quickly to every question, she used her new phrases to manage multiple conversations gracefully. "Let me just finish helping this guest and I'll be right with you." "That's a great question. Let me pull up your reservation." "Okay, so if I understand correctly, you need to change your checkout time." The guests felt heard and taken care of. Carmen felt confident and professional, and everything flowed much more smoothly than her old approach of trying to respond to everything immediately or falling into awkward silences. Marco from Venice had a similar experience using these techniques during English conference calls for his engineering job. Instead of feeling pressured to have immediate answers to technical questions, he learned to say, "That's a good point. Let me think about the best approach for that." Or, "Well, based on what you're describing, I think we have a few options." This gave him time to consider the technical details while keeping himself engaged in the conversation. The most important thing to understand about filler words and buying time phrases is that they're tools for confident communication, not signs of weakness or uncertainty. When you use them naturally and appropriately, you actually sound more professional and fluent because you're managing conversations the same way native speakers do. Don't try to learn new words every day. Instead, use the same words and phrases repeatedly until they become automatic. Alexandra from Lisbon focused on mastering 50 common phrases instead of learning 500 new words. She could express most of her thoughts with these phrases and felt much more confident. When words become automatic, you don't have to think about them during conversation. Alexandra came to me feeling completely overwhelmed by English vocabulary. She was a marketing coordinator for a Portuguese travel company that was expanding into international markets, and she felt like she was drowning in all the English words she thought she needed to learn. Alexandra had notebooks filled with vocabulary lists, flashcard apps on her phone, and she spent hours every week trying to memorize new words that she hoped would make her English sound more professional and sophisticated. The problem was that Alexandra rarely used most of these new words in real conversations. She would spend time learning words like comprehensive, facilitate, optimize, and innovative. But when she actually needed to speak English with international clients or partners, she would freeze up trying to remember the perfect vocabulary instead of communicating her ideas clearly with words she already knew well. Alexandra told me about a phone call with a potential client from Germany who was interested in Portuguese wine tours. She had prepared extensively for this call, studying wine vocabulary and tourism terminology. But when the client asked her a simple question about tour logistics, Alexandra's mind went blank because she was trying to remember the fancy words she had studied instead of just explaining the information using familiar, comfortable language. After that frustrating call, Alexandra realized that her approach to vocabulary learning was actually making her less confident and less effective in English conversations. She was spending so much mental energy trying to access recently learned words that she couldn't focus on connecting with people and communicating her ideas clearly. I introduced Alexandra to what I call the recycling method of language learning. Instead of constantly adding new vocabulary to her mental dictionary, she would focus on using the same core set of words and phrases repeatedly until they became completely automatic and natural. The goal was to develop a reliable foundation of language that she could use confidently in any situation, rather than a huge collection of words that she might or might not remember when she needed them. We started by identifying the 50 most useful phrases for Alexandra's specific work situation. These weren't fancy or impressive phrases, but they were the building blocks that would allow her to handle most of the conversation she needed to have in English. Phrases like, "I'd be happy to help you with that. Let me explain how this works. That's a great question. Here's what I recommend. And would that work for you?" The key was not just learning these phrases once, but using them repeatedly in different contexts until they became completely automatic. Alexandra practiced using the same phrase in multiple situations. "I'd be happy to help you with that" could be used when someone asked about tour prices, accommodation options, transportation details, or restaurant recommendations. One versatile phrase could handle dozens of different conversations. Within just 2 weeks of focusing on recycling her core phrases instead of learning new vocabulary, Alexandra noticed a dramatic improvement in her confidence during English conversations. She stopped feeling like she was constantly searching her memory for the right words because her essential phrases were always ready and available. This mental freedom allowed her to focus on listening to her clients, understanding their needs, and building genuine connections. But the recycling method isn't just about memorizing phrases mechanically. It's about developing such familiarity with your core language that you can use it creatively and flexibly. As Alexandra became more comfortable with her 50 phrases, she started naturally combining them in different ways, adapting them to specific situations, and using them as launching points for more detailed explanations. For example, once "let me explain how this works" became completely automatic for Alexandra, she could use it confidently to introduce explanations about anything: tour itineraries, booking procedures, payment options, or cancellation policies. The phrase itself was simple, but it gave her a reliable way to begin any explanation, which reduced her anxiety and improved her fluency. I had another student, Paulo from Porto, who experienced similar success with this approach. Paulo was a software developer who needed to participate in English-speaking team meetings and explain technical concepts to international colleagues. He had been trying to learn sophisticated technical vocabulary, but he often got lost trying to remember complex terms during important discussions. When Paulo shifted to the recycling method, he focused on mastering simple, flexible phrases that he could use to explain any technical concept. Phrases like, "the way this works is," "the main problem here is," "what I'm thinking is," and "the solution would be to." These basic building blocks allowed Paulo to communicate effectively about any technical topic because he wasn't dependent on remembering specific vocabulary for each different situation. The power of repetition and recycling extends beyond just work situations. Elena from Madrid used this method to improve her social English when she moved to Dublin for university. Instead of trying to learn all the slang and cultural references her Irish classmates used, Elena focused on mastering a small set of social phrases that would work in any casual conversation. That sounds interesting. I've never thought about it that way. What do you think about? That reminds me of. And I had a similar experience. With these reliable phrases always ready, Elena could participate naturally in group conversations without worrying about whether she knew the perfect words for every topic. She could show interest, ask questions, share experiences, and connect with people using language that felt comfortable and automatic to her. The recycling method works because it mimics how children naturally learn their first language. Children don't learn hundreds of new words every day. They learn a few words or phrases, then use them over and over in many different contexts until those words become completely natural and automatic. Then they gradually add new language on top of that solid foundation. Most adult language learners try to do the opposite. They try to add new vocabulary constantly without ever developing true mastery and automaticity with their existing knowledge. This creates a situation where they know many words superficially, but can't access them quickly and confidently when they need them in real conversations. When I work with students on the recycling method, I always emphasize that mastery is more valuable than quantity. It's better to use 50 phrases perfectly and confidently than to half remember 500 words that might fail you when you're under pressure. True fluency comes from having language that's so automatic you don't have to think about it, which frees your mind to focus on your message and your connection with other people. Alexandra's breakthrough moment came during a presentation to international tourism partners about Portuguese cultural experiences. Instead of trying to use impressive vocabulary she might forget, she built her entire presentation using her core 50 phrases. She felt completely confident and natural because every phrase was familiar and automatic. The presentation was a huge success, and several partners commented on how clear and engaging her communication style was. Alexandra realized that simple, confident language is always more effective than complicated language delivered with hesitation and uncertainty. Start conversations about topics you know well and feel passionate about. If you love cooking, talk about food. If you enjoy sports, discuss your favorite team. When Marcus from Frankfurt started joining English conversations about football, his comfort with the topic made speaking much easier. Your expertise in the subject helps carry the conversation even when your English isn't perfect. Marcus had been living in London for 8 months, working as a financial analyst for an international bank. His technical English was excellent. He could handle complex reports and presentations about market analysis, but he struggled with social conversations with his British colleagues. During coffee breaks or after-work gatherings, Marcus would sit quietly while his coworkers chatted about weekend plans, current events, or personal interests. He felt like he was missing out on the human connections that make work enjoyable and help build professional relationships. Marcus told me that he felt like two different people. At his desk, analyzing financial data and writing reports, he was confident and articulate in English. But in the break room or at office social events, he became quiet and withdrawn. He understood what people were saying, but he couldn't think of anything interesting to contribute to conversations about British television shows, local restaurants, or weekend activities that he wasn't familiar with. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered that several of his colleagues were passionate football fans. Marcus had been following German football since he was a child. He knew everything about the Bundesliga, European championships, player statistics, team strategies, and football history. In German, he could talk about football for hours with enthusiasm and expertise. But he had never tried discussing football in English because he was worried about not knowing the specific vocabulary or making mistakes with technical terms. I encouraged Marcus to overcome this hesitation and join a conversation about football the next time the opportunity arose. I explained to him that when you're passionate and knowledgeable about a topic, your enthusiasm and expertise carry you through any language challenges. People are much more interested in hearing genuine insights from someone who really knows and loves a subject than perfect pronunciation of every word. The next Monday morning, Marcus overheard colleagues discussing the weekend's Premier League matches. Instead of staying silent as usual, Marcus took a deep breath and joined the conversation. He said, "I watched the Manchester United game. I think their midfield strategy was really interesting." His colleagues immediately perked up and asked him to elaborate. Marcus found himself explaining tactical formations, comparing Premier League playing styles to Bundesliga approaches, and sharing his predictions for upcoming matches. What amazed Marcus was how naturally the English flowed when he was talking about something he truly understood and cared about. Yes, he occasionally struggled with specific football terminology in English, but his colleagues were happy to help him find the right words. More importantly, they were genuinely interested in his perspective as someone who followed both German and English football closely. From that day forward, football became Marcus's bridge into social conversations at work. Colleagues started seeking out his opinions on matches, asking him about German players in the Premier League, and inviting him to watch games at local pubs. These conversations led naturally to discussions about other topics: German culture, London neighborhoods, weekend plans, restaurant recommendations. Marcus discovered something crucial that many English learners don't realize. When you start from a position of knowledge and passion, you feel confident and engaged, which makes everything about communication easier. You're not worried about impressing people with perfect English because you're focused on sharing something you genuinely care about. This shift in focus from language performance to content sharing transforms the entire experience of speaking English. I had a similar experience with Sofia from Barcelona, who was a professional chef struggling with English conversations in London's international culinary scene. Sofia was incredibly talented and knowledgeable about Mediterranean cuisine, but she felt intimidated networking with other chefs and food industry professionals because she worried about her English skills. When Sofia started focusing conversations on cooking techniques, ingredient sourcing, and recipe development, everything changed. Her passion for food and deep expertise in culinary arts gave her confidence and natural talking points. She could explain complex cooking processes, share stories about traditional Spanish dishes, and offer professional insights that other chefs found valuable and interesting. Sofia realized that her culinary knowledge was her greatest asset in English conversations, not a liability to overcome. Food industry professionals were much more interested in learning from her expertise than judging her accent or occasional vocabulary mistakes. Her authentic passion and professional experience made her someone people wanted to talk to and learn from. The comfort zone strategy works for any area of knowledge or interest. Daniel from Rome, who was passionate about photography, started joining English-speaking photography groups and online forums. His technical knowledge and artistic eye gave him credibility and interesting things to contribute, even when his English wasn't perfect. Photography provided a natural framework for conversations about equipment, techniques, locations, and creative vision. Elena from Stockholm used her love of environmental science to connect with English-speaking colleagues at international conferences. Her expertise in sustainable energy research gave her confidence to participate in panel discussions, ask informed questions, and network with professionals from around the world. Her scientific knowledge carried her through any language uncertainties. The key insight is that expertise and passion create natural conversation flow. When you know a lot about a topic and care about it genuinely, you have endless things to say. You have opinions, experiences, stories, and insights that other people find interesting. This abundance of content makes the language feel less important because you're focused on sharing valuable information rather than worrying about perfect expression. Your comfort zone topics also provide natural vocabulary building opportunities. Instead of trying to memorize random word lists, you'll naturally learn the English terms you need to discuss your areas of interest. Marcus learned football vocabulary through real conversations about matches he had watched. Sofia picked up culinary terms while discussing recipes with other chefs. This vocabulary learning feels natural and stays with you because it's connected to genuine interests and real usage. Another advantage of the comfort zone approach is that it helps you develop your unique voice in English. Instead of trying to sound like everyone else or using generic conversation topics, you're bringing your own personality, interests, and expertise into your English communication. This makes you more memorable and authentic in professional and social situations. Lorenzo from Milan discovered this when he started talking about Italian design and architecture with international business partners. His knowledge of design history, his insights into contemporary Italian aesthetics, and his passion for visual arts made him a fascinating conversation partner. People remembered him not just as another Italian businessman, but as someone with unique perspectives and valuable cultural insights to share. The comfort zone strategy also helps with confidence because you're operating from a position of strength rather than weakness. Instead of trying to fake interest in topics you don't know well, you're sharing genuine knowledge and enthusiasm. This authenticity comes through in your voice, your body language, and your overall communication style. Building on your comfort zones doesn't mean limiting yourself to only discussing familiar topics forever. Instead, it means using your areas of strength as launching points for broader English communication. As you become more confident discussing familiar subjects, you naturally develop the skills and confidence to explore new topics and expand your conversational range. Marcus found that his success with football conversations gave him confidence to participate in other workplace discussions. The social connections he built through football led to invitations to other activities and conversations about different topics. His comfort zone became a foundation for broader social integration rather than a limitation. Commit to speaking English for just 5 minutes every day, even if it's to yourself. Set a timer and don't stop talking until it goes off. Talk about your plans, describe what you see around you, or share your opinions about something. Elena from Stockholm did this every morning while drinking coffee and noticed improvement within weeks. 5 minutes seems small, but consistency creates massive results. Elena contacted me after months of frustration with her English-speaking progress. She was a project manager for a Swedish tech company that worked with international clients, and her job required regular video calls and presentations in English. Elena's reading and listening skills were excellent. She could understand complex technical documents and follow detailed meetings without any problems, but when it came time for her to speak, she felt like her English abandoned her completely. Elena told me that she had tried many different approaches to improve her speaking. She had taken conversation classes, practiced with language exchange partners, and even hired a private tutor for weekly sessions. But despite all this effort and expense, she still felt nervous and unprepared every time she needed to speak English professionally. She could handle basic conversations, but longer explanations or spontaneous discussions left her feeling anxious and inadequate. The problem Elena described is incredibly common among English learners who focus most of their energy on formal study and scheduled practice sessions. She was getting English speaking practice once or twice a week during structured lessons, but this wasn't enough frequency to build the automaticity and confidence she needed for natural conversation flow. I explained to Elena that speaking fluency is like physical fitness. If you only exercise once or twice a week, you'll make some progress, but you won't develop the strength and endurance you need for demanding activities. Speaking English requires the same kind of consistent, daily practice to build the mental and physical habits that support confident communication. But I also understood that Elena's schedule was already packed with work responsibilities, family commitments, and other activities. She didn't have time for hour-long practice sessions every day, and the idea of adding more formal study time to her routine felt overwhelming rather than motivating. That's when I introduced Elena to the 5-minute daily challenge. The concept is simple but incredibly powerful. Every single day, without exception, set a timer for 5 minutes and speak English continuously until the timer goes off. No preparation, no specific topics, no pressure to be perfect. Just 5 minutes of continuous English speaking, even if you're talking to yourself in your living room. Elena was skeptical at first. She said, "Julia, 5 minutes seems so short. How can that possibly make a difference when I'm already taking conversation classes for an hour every week?" I explained to her that the magic isn't in the length of each practice session, but in the consistency and the daily habit formation. When you speak English for 5 minutes every single day, several important things happen. First, you're training your mouth and tongue to move comfortably with English sounds and rhythms on a daily basis. Second, you're developing mental pathways that make English thinking and speaking feel more automatic. Third, you're building confidence through successful daily experiences with English speaking. Fourth, you're creating a habit that feels manageable and sustainable rather than overwhelming. Elena decided to try the challenge for 1 month. She chose to do her 5 minutes every morning while drinking her first cup of coffee before checking emails or starting her workday. I suggested she start with simple topics: what she planned to do that day, what she could see from her kitchen window, her thoughts about the weather, her plans for the upcoming weekend. The first few days were challenging for Elena. 5 minutes felt surprisingly long when she was trying to fill it with continuous speaking. She would run out of things to say after 2 or 3 minutes and then struggle to keep talking until the timer went off. But I had warned her about this initial difficulty and encouraged her to push through even when she felt like she was repeating herself or saying uninteresting things. By the end of the first week, Elena noticed that 5 minutes was starting to feel more natural. She had developed a routine of topics that worked well for her morning practice: reviewing her schedule for the day, describing what she had done the evening before, talking about her current projects at work, sharing her thoughts about books she was reading or shows she was watching. After 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. Elena realized that she was actually looking forward to her 5-minute English speaking time. It had become a pleasant part of her morning routine, like a mental warm-up that helped her feel prepared for the day ahead. More importantly, she noticed that English words and phrases were coming to her more quickly and naturally during these practice sessions. The real breakthrough came after 3 weeks when Elena had an unexpected English conference call at work. Usually, she would spend several minutes beforehand feeling anxious and preparing what she wanted to say. But this time, she found herself speaking much more naturally and confidently from the very beginning of the call. The daily 5-minute practice had built up her English-speaking stamina and automaticity, to the point where switching to English felt less jarring and more natural. Elena completed her first month of the 5-minute challenge and was amazed by the cumulative effect. She had spent a total of just 2.5 hours practicing English speaking, spread across 30 days, but the improvement in her confidence and fluency was more noticeable than months of weekly conversation classes. The key insight Elena discovered is that consistency trumps intensity when it comes to building speaking fluency. Daily practice, even for short periods, creates stronger neural pathways and more reliable habits than longer but infrequent practice sessions. Your brain and mouth need regular reinforcement to develop automaticity with English sounds, rhythms, and expression patterns. I had similar success with Marco from Venice, who worked as a tour guide for international visitors. Marco adopted the 5-minute challenge during his lunch break every day. He would sit in a quiet park near his workplace and practice describing Italian art, architecture, and history in English. This daily practice helped him develop smooth, confident explanations that made his tours much more engaging for English-speaking tourists. Nina from Copenhagen used the 5-minute challenge while walking her dog every evening. She would practice explaining her work in sustainable fashion, discussing environmental issues, or sharing her thoughts about current events. This outdoor practice helped her feel more comfortable speaking English in informal, real-world settings rather than just in classroom environments. The beauty of the 5-minute challenge is its flexibility and sustainability. You can do it anywhere, anytime, about any topic. If you miss a day, you just start again the next day without guilt or complicated catch-up requirements. The low time commitment makes it easy to maintain even during busy periods, travel, or life changes. One of the most important aspects of this challenge is learning to speak continuously without stopping. In regular conversations, we often pause, think, restart sentences, or stay silent while organizing our thoughts. But the 5-minute challenge trains you to keep speaking even when you're not sure what to say next, which builds important conversational stamina and teaches you to work through momentary mental blocks without losing momentum. Elena found that this continuous speaking practice helped her become much more comfortable with the natural messiness of real conversations. She learned to keep talking while thinking, to rephrase ideas when she couldn't remember specific words, and to trust that her overall message would come through even if individual sentences weren't perfect. After 3 months of consistent 5-minute daily practice, Elena felt like a different person in English-speaking professional situations. Her colleagues began commenting on how much more confident and articulate she seemed during international calls and presentations. Elena realized that this simple, sustainable daily habit had accomplished what months of expensive formal lessons hadn't achieved. This might feel uncomfortable at first, but recording yourself speaking English is incredibly valuable. Sophie from Copenhagen records herself explaining her work or describing her weekend plans. When she listens back, she notices her progress and identifies areas to improve. You'll be surprised how much better you sound than you think. Plus, hearing your own voice speaking English builds familiarity and confidence. Sophie was a marketing director for a Danish design company that sold furniture internationally. Her written English was flawless. She could craft compelling marketing copy and detailed product descriptions that impressed clients around the world. But Sophie had never actually heard herself speak English for extended periods. She participated in video calls and gave presentations, but she was always so focused on getting through the conversation that she never paid attention to how she actually sounded. When Sophie first contacted me, she described feeling completely disconnected from her own English speaking abilities. She said it was like trying to improve her cooking without ever tasting the food she prepared. She knew she could communicate effectively because people understood her and responded appropriately, but she had no idea whether she sounded confident, professional, or natural when speaking English. Sophie's breakthrough moment came when she accidentally left her phone recording during a long English phone call with a client in New York. When she discovered the recording later, her first instinct was to delete it immediately because she felt embarrassed about hearing her own voice, but curiosity won, and she decided to listen to just a few minutes to see what she sounded like. What Sophie heard surprised her completely. Her English was much clearer and more fluent than she had imagined. Yes, she had a Danish accent, and occasionally she paused to search for words, but overall she sounded professional, articulate, and confident. The client had been engaged throughout the conversation, asking questions and showing genuine interest in her product explanations. Sophie realized that the nervous, struggling person she imagined herself to be in English conversations didn't match the reality of how she actually sounded. That accidental recording convinced Sophie to start intentionally recording herself speaking English on a regular basis. I suggested she begin with simple, low-pressure topics that didn't require preparation or performance. Sophie started recording herself for just 5 or 10 minutes every few days, talking about her work projects, describing her weekend activities, or sharing her opinions about design trends she was following. The first few intentional recordings felt awkward and artificial for Sophie. She was hyper-aware of the recording device and found herself speaking more carefully and formally than she would in natural conversation. But I encouraged her to push through this initial self-consciousness because the benefits of hearing yourself speak are too valuable to miss. After recording herself regularly for about 2 weeks, Sophie began to notice patterns in her English speaking that she had never been aware of before. She discovered that she had a habit of speeding up when discussing technical details, which sometimes made her harder to understand. She realized that she used certain phrases repeatedly, which wasn't necessarily a problem, but it gave her ideas for expanding her range of expressions. More importantly, Sophie began to hear her own progress over time. When she compared recordings from different weeks, she could clearly notice improvements in her fluency, confidence, and natural rhythm. This objective evidence of progress was incredibly motivating and helped her feel more positive about her English development. One of the most valuable discoveries Sophie made through her recordings was identifying specific words or phrases that consistently gave her trouble. There were certain English sounds that didn't exist in Danish, and she could hear herself either avoiding words that contained these sounds or mispronouncing them in ways that might confuse listeners. Instead of worrying generally about her pronunciation, Sophie could focus on practicing specific problem areas that she had identified through careful listening. The recording practice also helped Sophie develop a more realistic and positive self-image as an English speaker. Before she started listening to herself regularly, Sophie's perception of her English abilities was based mainly on her internal experience of speaking, which felt effortful and uncertain. Listening to her recordings helped her understand how she actually sounded to other people, which was much more competent and professional than her internal experience suggested. I had a similar experience with Andreas from Berlin, who was preparing for job interviews in English. Andreas was convinced that his German accent made him sound unprofessional and that his English was too slow and hesitant for competitive job markets. When he started recording practice interviews with himself, he was shocked to discover that he sounded much more capable and confident than he had imagined. Andreas used his recordings to practice answering common interview questions until his responses felt natural and automatic. He could listen back and identify places where he lost momentum or seemed uncertain, then practice those specific sections until they flowed smoothly. By the time he had real interviews, Andreas felt prepared and confident because he knew exactly how his English sounded and had eliminated the weak points he had identified through careful listening. The recording technique works particularly well for people who need to give presentations or speeches in English. Maria from Barcelona used recordings to practice conference presentations about sustainable architecture. She would record herself giving her entire presentation, then listen back while taking notes about pacing, clarity, and engagement. This allowed her to refine her delivery until she felt completely confident about how she sounded to her audience. One unexpected benefit that many of my students discover through recording practice is that it helps them become more comfortable with their own accent and speaking style. When you only experience your English speaking from the inside, it's easy to focus on mistakes and imperfections. But when you hear yourself from the outside, as your listeners do, you often realize that your accent and occasional mistakes don't interfere with communication nearly as much as you feared. Sophie found this particularly liberating. She had always worried that her Danish accent made her sound less professional in international business contexts, but listening to her recordings helped her understand that her accent was actually quite pleasant and didn't interfere with her message at all. This realization allowed her to focus on content and connection rather than worrying constantly about pronunciation. The key to successful recording practice is consistency and honest self-assessment. You want to record yourself regularly enough to track progress and identify patterns, but not so frequently that it becomes a source of anxiety or perfectionism. Sophie found that recording herself twice a week worked well for her schedule and goals. it's also important to listen to your recordings with a constructive mindset rather than a critical one. The goal isn't to identify everything wrong with your English, but to notice both strengths and areas for improvement. Sophie learned to celebrate the things she did well in each recording, while also noting specific aspects she wanted to work on. Modern technology makes recording practice incredibly easy and accessible. Sophie used the voice memo app on her phone, which allowed her to record anywhere and listen back immediately. Other students prefer using computer recording software that lets them organize recordings by date or topic. The specific technology doesn't matter as much as developing the habit of regular recording and listening. Another valuable approach is recording yourself having imaginary conversations or phone calls. Sophie would sometimes record herself explaining new products to imaginary clients or discussing project details with imaginary colleagues. This gave her practice with the specific types of English communication she needed most, while creating a safe space to experiment and improve. Here's the mindset shift that changes everything. Fluency means speaking smoothly and continuously, even with mistakes. Accuracy means being grammatically perfect. For confidence, choose fluency first. When you prioritize keeping the conversation flowing over being perfect, you'll sound more natural and feel more confident. Pietro from Florence made this switch and transformed his speaking within months. Pietro was a restaurant owner in Florence who had been studying English for over 5 years. His restaurant attracted tourists from around the world, and Pietro desperately wanted to connect with his international customers, share stories about traditional Tuscan cuisine, and create memorable dining experiences for visitors to his city. The problem was that Pietro had developed what I call perfectionist paralysis with his English speaking. Every time Pietro tried to speak English with customers, he would start a sentence, realize he wasn't sure about the correct verb form or article usage, stop mid-sentence to think about the rules, lose his train of thought, and end up feeling frustrated and embarrassed. His customers would wait patiently while Pietro struggled internally with English construction. But these painful pauses killed the natural flow of conversation and made everyone feel uncomfortable. Pietro told me that he could recite English rules perfectly. He knew when to use a versus an, he understood past perfect tense, he could explain complex conditional structures. But all of this theoretical knowledge became a burden rather than a help, when he was trying to have real conversations with real people about topics he cared passionately about. The turning point came when Pietro observed one of his regular customers, a businessman from Brazil who spoke English as his second language. This customer had a strong Portuguese accent, made occasional mistakes with articles and prepositions, and sometimes used slightly incorrect verb forms. But he was one of the most engaging conversationalists Pietro had ever encountered. He told fascinating stories about his travels, asked thoughtful questions about Italian culture, and created genuine connections with other diners at the restaurant. Pietro realized that this Brazilian customer's English was far from perfect by textbook standards, but it was incredibly effective for communication. He never stopped mid-sentence to correct himself. He never apologized for his accent or mistakes, and he never let small imperfections interrupt the flow of his stories and conversations. His focus was entirely on sharing his thoughts and connecting with people, not on demonstrating perfect English skills. This observation sparked Pietro's mindset transformation. I worked with him on understanding the crucial difference between fluency and accuracy, and why fluency should be his primary goal as someone who needed English for real-world communication rather than academic examination. Fluency is about rhythm, flow, and continuous communication. It's about being able to express your thoughts without constant interruption, to keep conversations moving naturally, to share ideas and emotions in a way that engages and connects with listeners. Fluent speakers might make mistakes, but they don't let those mistakes stop them from communicating effectively. Accuracy, on the other hand, is about grammatical correctness, perfect pronunciation, and following all the rules precisely. While accuracy is important in certain contexts, like formal writing or academic presentations, an obsession with accuracy can actually interfere with natural communication and prevent you from developing the confidence you need for real-world English use. Pietro began practicing what I call fluency-first speaking. Instead of planning every sentence carefully before speaking, he learned to start talking with a general idea of what he wanted to communicate and trust that his message would come through even if his English wasn't grammatically perfect. This required a fundamental shift in how he approached English conversations. The first time Pietro tried this approach with a customer from Germany, it felt terrifying. The customer asked about the history of his family restaurant, And instead of preparing a perfect response, Pietro just began talking. He said something like, "My grandfather, he started this restaurant in 1952. He was very young man, only 22 years. He loved cooking since he was child. His mother, she teach him all the traditional recipes from this region." Pietro's English contained several small mistakes in that response. He start should have been, he started, and he was child should have been, he was a child. But the German customer was completely engaged with Pietro's story and asked follow-up questions about his grandfather's recipes and the restaurant's evolution over the decades. The conversation flowed naturally for 15 minutes, with Pietro sharing family history, cooking philosophy, and local cultural insights. After that conversation, Pietro felt energized rather than exhausted. Instead of spending mental energy monitoring his language accuracy, he had focused entirely on sharing something he was passionate about with someone who was genuinely interested. The customer left feeling like he had experienced authentic Italian hospitality, and Pietro felt proud of his ability to connect across languages and cultures. This fluency-first approach transformed Pietro's entire relationship with English speaking. He stopped seeing mistakes as failures and started viewing them as natural parts of communication between people from different linguistic backgrounds. He realized that his customers weren't language teachers grading his performance. They were travelers interested in learning about Italian food and culture from someone with genuine expertise and passion. Within 3 months of adopting the fluency-first mindset, Pietro's English speaking had improved dramatically. Paradoxically, by worrying less about accuracy, he actually became more accurate over time. When you're not constantly stopping to second-guess yourself, you develop natural rhythm and confidence that make correct forms feel more automatic. I had a similar experience with Carmen from Seville, who worked as a tour guide for international visitors. Carmen had been paralyzed by perfectionist thinking, spending so much energy trying to avoid mistakes that she sounded robotic and rehearsed when explaining Spanish history and architecture. When she switched to fluency-first speaking, her tours became much more engaging and personal because she could focus on storytelling and connection rather than grammatical perfection. The fluency-first approach doesn't mean abandoning accuracy completely. It means prioritizing communication effectiveness over technical perfection. You still want to be understood clearly, and you still want to continue learning and improving your English skills. But you approach accuracy as a long-term development goal rather than an immediate performance requirement. One practical technique I taught Pietro was what I call momentum maintenance. When he noticed himself making a mistake while speaking, instead of stopping to correct it, he would continue with his thought and trust that his overall message was clear. If the mistake was significant enough to cause confusion, his listener would ask for clarification, and he could rephrase at that point. Another helpful strategy was learning to view mistakes as opportunities for connection rather than sources of embarrassment. When Pietro occasionally used an incorrect word or phrase, he found that customers often enjoyed helping him find the right expression, which created collaborative, friendly interactions rather than awkward moments. The psychological benefits of fluency-first thinking extend far beyond language skills. Pietro discovered that when he stopped trying to control every aspect of his English performance, he felt more relaxed and authentic in conversations. This authenticity made him more charismatic and memorable as a host, which ultimately benefited his business as well as his personal satisfaction. Pietro's transformation illustrates one of the most important principles of successful language learning. Perfect is the enemy of good. When you demand perfection from yourself, you create anxiety and self-consciousness that actually interfere with natural communication. When you accept that communication is inherently imperfect and focus on connection rather than performance, you free yourself to develop the confidence and fluency that make English speaking enjoyable rather than stressful. Now you have the tools, but knowledge without action creates no results. Choose 3 techniques from today's episode that resonated with you most. Write them down and commit to practicing them this week. Remember, becoming fluent and confident in English is a journey, not a destination. Every conversation, even the difficult ones, makes you stronger. You've got this. And I believe in you completely. If this episode helped you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Until next time, keep practicing and stay confident. Right now, as you're listening to these words, I want you to pause and really think about everything we've covered together today. We've talked about confidence connections, the power of simple sentences, daily speaking practice, mirror techniques, thinking directly in English, the 3-2-1 method, embracing your accent, using filler words naturally, recycling your core vocabulary, finding your comfort zones, the 5-minute daily challenge, recording yourself, and choosing fluency over accuracy. That's a lot of strategies, and I know it might feel overwhelming to think about implementing all of them at once. But here's what I've learned from working with thousands of English learners over the years. The people who make real, lasting progress don't try to do everything at once. They choose a few techniques that feel right for their situation and personality, and they commit to those techniques completely. I want you to think about your own English learning journey right now. What are the biggest challenges you face when speaking English? Is it the fear of making mistakes? Is it running out of things to say? Is it feeling nervous when people are listening to you? Is it the time delay while you translate from your native language? Is it feeling like your accent makes you hard to understand? Whatever your primary challenges are, there are specific techniques from today's discussion that directly address those exact problems. The key is matching your biggest needs with the most relevant strategies rather than trying to practice every technique we've discussed. Let me walk you through how to create your personal action plan. First, I want you to identify your 3 biggest speaking challenges. Maybe you struggle with confidence when talking to native speakers. Maybe you feel like your vocabulary is too limited. Maybe you have trouble thinking of things to say in social conversations. Be honest with yourself about what holds you back most consistently. Once you've identified your main challenges, look back at today's techniques and choose the 3 that most directly address those specific problems. If confidence is your biggest issue, you might choose the mirror technique, the 3-2-1 method, and embracing your accent. If fluency is your main concern, you might focus on daily speaking practice, thinking directly in English, and choosing fluency over accuracy. The important thing is that you're making conscious, strategic choices rather than randomly trying different approaches. When you have a clear plan that addresses your specific needs, you're much more likely to stick with your practice and see real results. Now I want you to make these 3 techniques concrete and actionable. Don't just say, "I'm going to practice speaking to myself." Instead, say, "I'm going to practice speaking to myself for 5 minutes every morning while I drink my coffee, starting tomorrow." Don't just say, "I'm going to use the mirror technique." Instead, say, "I'm going to spend 2 minutes every evening practicing introducing myself in front of my bathroom mirror." The more specific you make your commitments, the more likely you are to follow through with them. Vague intentions like, "I should practice more," rarely lead to consistent action. Specific plans like, "I will record myself speaking for 5 minutes every Tuesday and Friday evening," create accountability and make it easy to track your progress. I also want you to think about how these techniques will fit into your existing routine. The most successful English learners don't add hours of new study time to their schedules. Instead, they find ways to integrate practice into activities they're already doing. Practice thinking in English while you're commuting to work. Use the 3-2-1 method before important phone calls. Talk to yourself in English while you're cooking dinner. When you connect new habits to existing routines, they become much easier to maintain over time. Your brain already has established patterns around your daily activities, and you can use these existing patterns to support your English development. Remember that progress in language learning isn't always linear or immediately visible. Some weeks you'll feel like you're making huge improvements. Other weeks you might feel stuck or even like you're going backwards. This is completely normal and doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. Language development happens in waves, with periods of rapid progress followed by periods of consolidation where your brain is processing and integrating new skills. The key is consistency, not perfection. It's better to practice for 5 minutes every day than for 2 hours once a week. It's better to have imperfect conversations regularly than to wait until you feel ready for perfect conversations. It's better to use the techniques we've discussed imperfectly than to not use them at all while you wait for ideal conditions. I want you to also remember that every English speaker you admire went through the same challenges you're facing now. Every confident, fluent, non-native speaker had moments of doubt, embarrassment, and frustration. The difference between people who become confident English speakers and people who stay stuck isn't natural talent or perfect study methods. The difference is persistence and willingness to keep practicing even when progress feels slow. Your English journey is unique to you, and you shouldn't compare your progress to anyone else's timeline. Some people develop confidence quickly but need more time to improve accuracy. Other people achieve high accuracy but struggle with spontaneous conversation. Some people are naturally outgoing and find social practice easy, while others prefer structured, private practice methods. All of these different paths can lead to fluent, confident English communication. The most important thing is that you find approaches that work for your personality, your schedule, and your goals, then commit to practicing consistently over time. As we wrap up today's episode, I want you to feel excited rather than overwhelmed about your English development. You now have a toolkit of proven strategies that have helped thousands of learners develop confidence and fluency. You understand that becoming a confident English speaker isn't about perfection or elimination of your accent. It's about developing the skills and mindset that allow you to communicate effectively and authentically in any situation. The techniques we've discussed today aren't just theoretical concepts. They're practical tools that you can start using immediately. Some of them will feel natural and easy for you right away. Others might feel challenging or uncomfortable at first. Both responses are normal, and both types of techniques can be valuable for your development. Trust yourself to know which strategies resonate most strongly with your needs and learning style. Start with the techniques that feel most relevant and manageable, then gradually expand your practice as these initial approaches become habits.